Hey folks, my name is Tony Mo. I'm a newer GM. I've been running games for about a year now, weekly. And I like to talk about my experience as a GM and share some of the lessons I learn and just create general discussion and even occasionally a guide or a campaign diary for any of the campaigns that I am running. Today we're going to continue talking about our Cyberpunk Red campaign. This is technically campaign diary entry 2. Although it's going to be covering 2 weeks worth of sessions. These sessions were very much glued together in that the first session ended up being kind of cut in half at one point. It was like already going on 5 hours. We run pretty long sessions for our games. And, we were still in combat, and I was like, all right, it's like midnight. We're going to call it here. We'll pick up with combat next week and then roll into post-combat stuff. So we very much had a session that was like, narrative stuff, a little bit of downtime. We even passed a bit of time for the players into combat, and then we paused and we picked it from combat, and that rolled into some more narrative stuff, kind of setting up where the players are now. We're also very much in like a transitional period for the campaign, in that we already have one player who jumped to a new PC, and there's another player who's about to make a jump to a new PC. Again, this is a newer system at this point. We've now been running it for like 4 months. I think we're all really familiar with it, but it was a new system when we started. This is the first character for all of these players. And they're starting to realize like they want to try out other stuff, and I'm totally fine with that. It's been fun to find ways to like pull their new PCs in, and we're going to be doing such with the current Nomad, my buddy Alex. He's going to be leaving behind his character, Iggy, or short for Ignition, and rolling onto a character that is very much focused on investigation. He's a media role, but he's more focused on like cryptids, which is something that I have made a part of my Cyberpunk universe, Cyberpunk campaign already. And so we're going to run with that. He's actually going to be a reporter, a journalist who they actually found an article that was written by him, over a month ago of actually more than 2 months of in-game time and actually a month ago of out-of-game time. So definitely we're having fun, moving in an exciting direction. I've been designing really tense and difficult combat encounters for them, and they've just been barely scraping their way out of them, so it's been a ton of fun. But let's kind of talk about where the players are, starting at the beginning of last week's session, the session before this past one. So we're very much moving forward with the new PC Lynx on board, right? That's my buddy's Trevor character. He leaves behind Bandsaw. He's now playing Lynx, who is a detective for Danger Girl. His character is also a very low empathy character with a lot of cyber, who is borderline cyberpsychosis. So he's been messing around with playing a character that is very kind of unpredictable, I guess you could say at times, who is obsessed with cyber, for lack of a better way of saying it. And the players are kind of starting to come to the realization, other players, that like, hey, maybe we should, help Lynx out and, try and encourage them to get some therapy to help them. But that wasn't really the overlying narrative here. It's just kind of, I guess, the first thing that has sort of happened with the crew with this new character. So they weren't really prepared for any sort of a combat encounter going into this session, just because they didn't have like plans to go like directly get into combat this time. It doesn't mean I didn't have something planned or have something on the table if something happened. I was kind of curious just to see where they would go, where they would poke around with, because we started off the session with a bit of downtime, a bit of free time, just kind of, hey, what do you guys want to do? What do your players want to do? What do your PCs want to do? And so one of the first big things that's actually happened, we took turns, jumping across the different PCs, kind of resolving anything they wanted to handle, is that the business has had an offer from an individual by the name of Midnight. Midnight, it runs the Mohawk Place tavern, bar, you could say, in South Night City, in the combat zone where the players hang out the majority of the time. It's a place that also plays music. It's a very small venue. It's actually based on a real world venue where I live here in New York. The layout is exactly the same even. And it got shot up like during a show that the character Bandsaw did there, a PC, and Midnight, kind of reached out to the business as a fixer, somebody who is, in the know, is like, hey, would you want to go in on the business with me and expand this place? And so he actually does that. And the players have acquired a large amount of money in the past 4 months of of actual sessions. And so he's like, I want to talk with Midnight and see how much it would cost. And so we do a bunch of numbers. I had a bunch of stuff kind of prepped for what it might be like to invest in a business like this, to expand it. They end up doubling the size of the actual bar and show place where they're going to be able to put on concerts. They do like a Metal Storm kind of retrofitting to it as well. So a lot of the bar is like indestructible, like Metal Storm is. It's another bar that's in universe in Cyberpunk Red. They get to do that. You know, they redesign it so it'll be more profitable, so it won't have these awful like choke points for the crowds that the current Mohawk place has. And on top of that, the business comes up with the idea and says, you know, could I put in a nightclub, like a smaller place that's more relaxed, kind of like a safe zone for people to come and even, you know, potentially discuss business is something he ends up thinking about later on. And I was like, yeah, you know, let's go ahead and do some stuff for it. Like, think about that. And I kind of gave him like two options. I was like, you could like dig into the ground and like build a basement. That'd probably be more expensive. This is a multi-store building technically above the Mohawk place, but it's old and abandoned and very worn down. So you'd have to like clear out one of the floors and see if it was structurally stable. So we actually did some fun rolls for that. They find out that it's, you know, it needs some structural repairs. He ends up like spending the extra money on that. They get this nice nightclub going. Some of the other players, you know, go out and engage in some things as well. Lynx just kind of is, you know, starting to get curious about why Militech attacked them, why they had this hit squad after them, trying to uncover some trails, but mostly is just getting themselves acquainted with the new group. One of the players, the Nomad, Iggy, actually takes Lynx to the local gun store with a character they're already very familiar with. They've befriended, they've done good deeds for this character. This character's helped them out, Ash's gun store, as I call it. And he goes and buys like some more equipment, gets some help, sell some hand grenades for future combats. Iggy and Kick both actually partake in some more Nomad races with their race car, and have another very successful season. And at this point, we end up actually passing a pretty large amount of time. I wanted to sort of roll the players forward a few months and kind of unravel some narrative beats in front of them. And so we did that. Night City at this point kind of goes into this lull, right? This sort of this time of peace, where there's just not a lot of crazy shit happening, apart from the fact that this huge sort of case blows wide open with Max Tech in the NCPD. And that being that Max Tech was apparently being directly funded by Arasaka. Arasaka is not supposed to be in Night City, for those of you who don't know how things are in this timeline. So this kind of like comes out, and I end up using this then to build into the direction the players are going now, and to build out my new narrative beat that I want for the players, you know, something for them to uncover and dig into. I don't want to expose all this information, just be like, here's this lore dump of what's going on now. Try and interact this. I want them to uncover this through encounters, narrative, and from a combat perspective. So this was a great way to plant the seed and be like, hey, something's going on with Max Tech. They've been receiving funding and, you know, potentially having their directives rather outside of just chasing down cyber psychos, being controlled by a corporation. So they might be taking actions and engaging things in NC that are actually for the benefit of Arasaka directly. So this blows out. Then we pass like another month of time. We kind of zone in then after that at all of them sitting at Joe's, which is this like small, you know, retro style cafe where they are good friends with the guy who owns it. He is good friends with them because he actually gets organic beef for his burgers from the Nomads that one of the players is a part of through their guerrilla farming cooperation. And so they're there kind of hanging out, the four of them at this diner table, having this conversation, drinking milkshakes, eating french fries and burgers, talking with Joe. And they're just like, so like, it's been so quiet. Like, you know, what's going on? I've been trying to dig into this. The character Business, who has this other sort of narrative beat that is very much tied to this, going with an individual by the name of Sophie. Sophie is the twin sister of a character he actually put in his backstory who passed away, who died kind of almost because of him. He kind of blames himself for it, right? He got caught, but he got blackmailed essentially by a corporate executive named Mark Rowe, who was working for Petrochem at the time. And he set Rose, who was a netrunner he worked with, and the business up. So the player character and NPC he worked with in the past, they got set up trying to blackmail to get the business and Rose to work exclusively for him. And he's like, no, I don't do that. So he leaves it out. Rose ends up getting killed because of this. And he kind of, you know, that's very much how his character came about, and how his character acts and performs now is because of those past tragedies, the things that have happened to him. And so I was like, well, I want to bring this back, give him a chance for some revenge against Mark Moreau. And so, as it turns out, Rose had a twin sister, Sophie, who was somebody who was kind of raised in a place of privilege, disconnected from her sister, but did communicate with her sister. Two different lives, essentially, right? But when she finds out what happens to Rose, she abandons her life of luxury and disappears into the shadows and becomes this ghost that roams Night City. This very talented netrunner and solo who goes about digging, trying to uncover the plot that led to her sister's death, looking for revenge. She then reaches out to business, obviously knowing their relationship. Hello, doggo. And this is where this narrative beat comes together. And so now we have all these paths that I'm trying to connect, right? The players are all they don't know it right now, but they're all a part of this same beat, which is Arasaka. They already know Arasaka's in NC, right? That was a part of the first big narrative we spun out. Arasaka running the Shadow program where they're cloning, making these very accurate clones of individuals to replace people in power in Night City. So they're actually running like Militech, and they're running, Biotechnica just from the shadows with these clones, these shadow agents, if you will, right? And they kind of are able to actually put a rough stop to that by stealing and destroying this cloning data. And so now I'm like, okay, where can we take this further? How can we have Arasaka, sort of respond to that? They're a big corporation. They're not fucking around. This isn't going to stop them. And so Arasaka's also been working with Petrochem and Zarafa to sort of establish, again, from the shadows, this sort of secret paramilitary force that could really start to overpower the forces of NC, essentially looking to just run NC as a way to then further gain control of other parts of the United States. And so that's where Black Tusk comes in. Black Tusk is this paramilitary force that I've created that is being built by Arasaka, Petrochem, and Zarafa. Zarafa has been brought into the fray because they're developing exosuits and prototype cyber drones and autonomous robots to make this paramilitary force something to be reckoned with, right? And so the first instance the players end up getting of this is during this session. We kind of have things, settled down. We lay in some narrative beats. The players get to do some of the things they've wanted to do. And as they head out of Joe's and drive back into South NC, I have them, driving on the road. I'm explaining, the weather, this moment, this kind of time of peace that NC is seeing. You see people, sort of more active. The combat zone that they've been in has actually been transforming over the past, going on like 4 months of in-game time or 3 months of in-game time. And so it's even becoming like a better place for people to live because of the work they've been doing with the greasers and even the tiger claws and just, a lot of transformation actually happening here, right? So very much a time of change. And I ended up having them do a perception check to kind of kick off the potential for things to lead into combat. And I've always made it clear that occasionally they'll catch a glimpse of like some synthetic birds, right? That maybe have made their way out of the more lavish zones of Night City and into the combat zone. And so I decided, let's use that. Let's use that as the spin, right? These in this case, they don't know, but these are Zarafa. These are Black Tusk drones, these birds. And so one of them rolls really high, and I'm like, you get a beat on these birds. You see more of them than usual flying in like a very unorganic, unnatural fashion, right? It's clear that they're synthetic, and you're familiar with them. You've seen them before. It doesn't seem too bizarre that they're there, but it's more bizarre that they seem to be kind of like circling this part of the combat zone where you guys are. And just as that happens, I roll in a car, sort of blacked out, low slung car that is following them. And, they take notice of it, and I'm like, they start responding to it. They make a few decisions. Business is the first one to pick this up. He communicates it to Iggy, who's driving, and Iggy's like, well, what do you think? Should we just you want to just try to lose him? Link's in the back is itching to already shoot them. I'm gonna climb out the window and shoot. And they're like, oh, hold on. And so he does actually make some really successful driving rolls. I say, you cut down a hill, you break line of sight, you manage to turn off into an alleyway. I did have the car, actually, the driver and the other car roll, though, and they're able to keep up. They end up critting, which was pretty much what they needed to do to keep up because he rolled very high for his driving maneuver. But so I'm like, oh, you think you're gone in the last second, you see that car reappear. And they're driving, and then they start talking a lot, right? They start having a big old conversation while this is happening. And I'm like, I'm going to let them go for a little bit. But once I feel like they've taken way too much time, we're going to go ahead and like have some things happen. This will be a perfect opportunity to spring this thing on them. So they're driving and like just arguing about what to do. This car still being behind them. And I'm like, all right, everybody roll perception. They all roll like dog shit. And I'm like, okay, you at the very last second, ignition, you turn your eyes to the front of the road and you see just traffic, right? Just all blocked up at this intersection. Like kind of what do you do? They decide, they slam on the brakes. I was like, you just barely stop. And they see a car stopped, and then they see a ton of Max Tech guys in armored ground cars, armored patrol cars, blocking the intersection, and already rifles out. Some of them pointed at one of the drivers who's in front of them. Some of them pointed at them. And this is where we kind of roll into the combating. Well, they don't know it's a combat engagement even yet. They're just like, oh shit, like how do we handle this? I give them like a few moments to think on it, and I'm like, you hear one of the Max Tech get on their speaker, guns pointed at your car, telling all 4 of you to get out. You're under arrest for crimes committed against Night City. And they're all like, what the fuck, And they like are trying to, again, they're trying to, this happens, they're still like at that point where they sometimes get caught up trying to figure out what to do. And I've reached a point now where I sometimes just cut them short. I'm like, you're taking way too long to make this decision. Like, I'm not going to give you all the time in the world. This is a reactive moment. You better make that decision. Otherwise, I'm gonna start having the NPCs making decisions. And that's what I did. The NPC like calls them out like 2 more times and is like, get out of the car, hands in the air, drop any weapons to the ground, turn the car off, get on all fours. They like hem and haw about this again. And then that's when I'm just like, okay, forget it. And I'm like, this guy shouts one more time, basically demanding it, pops the NPC who's in the car in front of them, and then just immediately like goes to start engaging them directly. And we go ahead and we roll. They decide, actually, sorry, I was going to say I don't end up rolling initiative. I was expecting them to get in combat. They decide to slam on the gas and try to drive out of there. They're like, okay, we're going to slam on the throttle and just try to get out. I was like, okay, here's what happens. They drive forward. I was like, you see the other Max Tech guy in the back. He pulls up this massive like harpoon looking gun, right? I was like, you are going to need to beat a 29 to dodge this, because they've already been like fucking around. They've got like no space. They're driving right past 2 Max Tech cars. Like, if you can beat a 29, I was like, you'll be able to evade whatever this thing is. They don't. They drive past it. They try to drive past it. This thing, like, too fast, too furious is them. Massive harpoon hits the front of the car, EMPs it, stops it entirely. They like all decide, okay, we're getting out. Like, we're engaging in combat. We roll initiative and we run into this massive combat encounter now. Had they even beaten that one, there was like 6 Max Tech guys on the ground already. They would have fired another one. This was a situation of like, these Max Tech individuals have been sent to bring them in alive, preferably, but they would have also happily killed them all and brought them in that way for, again, crimes committed against Night City. They've actually done a lot of stuff that could fall under that umbrella, especially with the knowledge that, this whole thing's been blown wide open. Arasaka has got a horse in the race with Max Tech and the NCPD. And so it was a bit of a surprising moment, I think, for them, which was great, because the moment I said roll initiative, there are several of them like, oh, okay. Like, oh, this is going down. Like, yeah, this is going down. And so, yeah, they end up in this combat, and I had a lot planned for this. Some of it didn't really work the way I was hoping. I actually ended up coming up with some better ideas after the fact. But the general idea I wanted here was, right, if they did end up getting engaged in combat here, which again, the idea was that they were going to be chased down one way or another. If I had to chase them down in a car, eventually Max Tech was going to throw everything at them. And if you know Cyberpunk, you just don't run away from Max Tech while you're in the middle of NC. Okay, it's not how it works. Not without a fight. And so I have a huge Max Tech Aerodyne swoop, and it drops all these guys off with massive riot shields. And I essentially designed this sort of like phalanx mechanic because I did want them to get arrested. And so these guys in the riot shield were going to have a 1d4 they roll every time it's their turn. They all move together as one unit as long as they're connected together in this phalanx formation with their massive riot shields up. And they're going to attempt to close in on individual players and handcuff and arrest them. the bonus here for them too was that I designed special riot shields. So these weren't just ballistic shields; these were massive armor piercing, just crazy bulletproof shields. And so these guys had a ton of SP on these shields. They also provided cover for one another when they were in formation. So the players had to take aim shots to be able to actually shoot past the shields or able to do any reasonable amount of damage, basically. And so there was a lot of them trying to flank the units while they were progressing. It worked. I think in retrospect, I would have had them just roll a higher dice and made them more immediately of a threat in terms of arresting the players, because I did kind of have ideas in my head for what would happen if one of the players did, actually get taken captive and was arrested. I'm sure the players would have been ruthless in an attempt to chase and engage that, and we could have ran with that. But they ended up being a little bit more of a just a tension mechanic than an actual threat mechanic in the end, which I was okay with. Kind of part way through the engagement, I realized I could have done more with the custom guns I gave these guys. These guys had burst fire revolvers that were very heavy pistols that had a burst mechanic that were super nasty. They were meant to do a ton of damage. And then they were going to load them with rubber bullets to incapacitate targets if they needed to shoot instead of getting in close for grapples. I just didn't really end up using that a lot, and I kind of wish I would have. There were some ideas later on I had for them firing in a group, and I was just like, I didn't really want to run with it too much just because it wasn't something that I think was made clear to the players early enough. The riot shield mechanic and them as the phalanx, that was easy for the players to understand. I think they knew what they had to get away from. They were clearly trying to be arrested here, and that felt good to me. I was like, hey, this is like a moment of concern for them. They're using like grenades and stuff, trying to wipe these guys out and just watching them eat like huge rounds with these riot shields. And so that was great. I think that worked out well. And that ended up kind of, being that first half of the encounter's like primary tension mechanic. Now, as we roll into the end of that encounter, actually, one of these hunter max tech agents I made, who were designed to kind of weaken the players so the riot guys could move in. They had tear gas and sleep grenades they could use. Dumps a sleep grenade on the roof where two of the players are and is able to actually they fail their rolls. So they get knocked out cold. And I'm like, this is half the team is asleep. This is where the tables are going to turn for them. Shit's going to get bad. But then they had already made a call to one of their contacts in the Greasers, which is the local gang in South Night City that they've been working with, Link. And Link already called for backup. And it works out so perfectly for them because I already, I told them, okay, you're going to get Link's like, you'll have reinforcements soon. I tell them you've got basically 2 rounds and it looks like Link's going to be able to send something. So they know how long they had to wait. I wanted to give them something like that. I had designed this encounter so that backup would absolutely be there. And honestly, if they hadn't called, backup was going to show up because they were fighting on their home turf. And so there is a small group of young greaser youths, younger individuals in South Night City who are part of the Greasers who the business has sold equipment to, firearms and gear for them. To help them deal with the Red Chrome threat when it was really predominant, invading, and a lot of Red Chrome were attacking the Tiger Claws, who they have an allegiance, like an alliance with, as well as the Greasers. And so he's kind of made friends with them. And so I was like, I want this character now to really come to life. And this character, Sam, is going to show up with his crew, Ryu and Abria, and they're going to, be this backup. These kitted out young kids who are actually kind of cracked, kind of dope. And they all had like some fun individual mechanics I made for them. Ryu has his own custom rocket launcher that has like a painting on the side of it that says, "Mama says you can never be too prepared." Abria is this med tech who has a zipline gun that we end up using and ends up being a big part of the combat. But yeah, so I have them. I go ahead and roll their initiative order, and they show up in initiative right after the business and Iggy, who are at the top, who had both just gone down. And so then I'm trying to figure out, okay, if I'm going to have them show up, I don't want to just send them to help the 2 players who passed out because they don't know what's going on here. They're going to fly in on a gyrocopter, and jump off onto the rooftops or onto the ground here and be deployed to help out the PCs. But I don't want this to feel like, oh yeah, you definitely, you did that because you were worried about us being asleep. I wanted there to be just chance here. And so I made it a dice roll. And so there's 4 PCs left. And I said, pick a number starting with the first one. I'm pretty sure Business, who's asleep, says 4. Iggy says 2 or whatever, who's right next to him. The other guys say 3 and 1. I roll the 1d4. It's a 4. Like, it's your lucky day. You guys hear like loud heavy metal music as this like raggedy gyrocopter flies in and drops off this, group of peppy, young looking, very in fashion individuals. They land on the roof. They come running over. I was like, just as you're like passing out from the sleep gas, you see these neon green sneakers and you see this med tech drop down to you with their hair all done off wonderly. And this is a Bria. She drops down and, basically is able to wake them from sleep. Ryu drops in, Sam drops in, they wake up the other characters, and I'm just like, they're all real like lively and peppy. They've seen some shit already, but they haven't like really seen some shit, so they're still pretty positive about terrible situations, these young folks. You see Bria's got like this P90, she's got this like med tech case on her side with this little robot arm that hands her stuff. You guys see Ryu immediately with this rocket launcher slung to his back. And Sam is kind of like generic Cyberpunk 2077 guy intentionally. He's got this big revolver and got like the collar and stuff and everything just like V. And I was like, yeah, they like show up and save your asses. And my player character Business, my buddy Mike, was just like, was this the fucking Teen Titans? And so that's the name they ended up getting. I was like, yeah, it's the Teen Titans. And that's where we end up ending combat for that night, and we pick up a week later. Right from that point, actually no, I'm sorry. Before this all happens, I drop the bomb on them. And this is actually part of why they end up getting knocked out. This massive exoskeleton, might as well be a mech, 5 meters tall, gets dropped off by this unbranded Aerodyne. And this is where they don't know it, but they're being introduced to the first instance of Black Tusk showing its force in the streets of NC. And so I designed this custom Exo Hunter, I called it. Which is, it's a fucking mech, basically. It's got a pilot in it, but it's huge. It is a very large exosuit that has a gun on one hand that rotates between a rocket launcher and a machine gun. It's got a massive riot shield type deal. It has a ton of equipment, and I drop this thing on the players. They end up like dodging a rocket launcher shot, and then they get put to sleep, and then the Teen Titans show up, and then we go ahead and rotate towards the next week. And so they get a week to stew on how they're going to potentially deal with this massive mech that is now stomping the streets of NC and just laying, heavy guns fire into them. They have a microwaver that they actually got just on chance. They went to a night market. They get really friendly with this fellow with this Australian accent who runs like, the gear and stuff, this emporium, and he's like, come to my van afterwards. He's like, and I'll show you some of my secret gear. And he pulls out this microwaver, and they end up buying it off of him. And so they're all like, oh, the day is saved. We got the microwaver. Little did they know that I already had designed sort of some systems for potential EMP abuse against this thing. And so as we go into the next encounter, the thing you need to know about the Exo Hunter is that it has like several components. It also has a ridiculous amount of armor. So this thing is in armor like they've never dealt with before. Its SP was 28 to the body. So essentially they had to roll higher than 28 damage to do any damage to this thing, which is where Ryu is going to come into play with his rocket launcher very soon. But to start, it's just them kind of like figuring out what they can do with this thing. And so they do roll a few bits of perception. They roll so poorly that it's almost impossible for me to like give them any information. I'm talking like ones and stuff. I think I like just give them a general idea. You can see this thing is very heavily armored. It's not like a metal or armor plating you're familiar with that looks like something you've never seen before. It's not until we're like well into combat. Abria's dropped out her zip line. Ryu has actually managed to use his rocket launcher that does like 96 damage to do insane crits. He rolls like 3 6s and 3 5s. And is able to actually start to damage this thing a little bit, that the Business decides to take an aim shot. He's like, can I take an aim shot where the pilot is? And I'm like, yeah. And so with that, he lands a really good roll, high damage. I was like, go ahead and roll perception. He crits on perception. I'm like, you realize that this part where the cockpit or where the pilot is clearly has much weaker armor plating. Like it's a glass of some sort. And so that was actually just an SP of 11. They didn't have to do much there, and the idea was always going to be like, if they could focus on the pilot, they can kill the pilot, and then this thing is going to be autonomous. But at least the pilot will be out of the equation. That's going to limit some of the things this thing can do. I had it like reduce its move speed, or it would have reduced its move speed. They ended up doing this like so late on that it didn't really matter. And then on top of that, it did have modules that they could eventually identify and target. And so as they start EMPing this thing, I give them opportunities to learn about the way that this mech works. Every time Kick uses the microwaver on this thing, I basically roll a dice for the like 6 parts that I made, which included the legs. They were kind of tied together as one. There's a targeting system. There was an oxygen system that could have actually like forced the pilot to open and have no armor plating, because the idea is that this is a very closed mechanism that could even function underwater or out of atmosphere if it needed to, up in space where, you know, there's actually stuff happening. And it also had a sonar system that would allow it to like ping and do a mark for death mechanic, which it never got to use because they actually disabled that first. So I would roll a dice and it would just hit a random part, because that's kind of how EMP is supposed to work in Cyberpunk. The GM decides what gets disabled. And so I rolled the dice, but I gave them a chance to roll perception every time they engaged it directly like that, opening up opportunities for them to kind of get a read on what they might have done. And eventually Kick is able to start to identify some parts of this thing. He ends up like EMPing all of it though. Like he literally just decided, I've got the microwave, I'm going to use all the ammunition I have for this thing and EMP the shit out of this thing. In the meantime, they're doing damage to it. They're fighting. Ryu ends up helping them out a ton with that rocket launcher. It wipes out the rest of the Riot guys. And so now they're kind of in this battle with just this exoskeleton that is still going to town. Now here's where things get really interesting. Okay. As I mentioned, player Alex, he kind of wants to move on from his Nomad Ignition, and he's got this other character he wants to do. I never just want to like kill off a character just because somebody's like, well, I'm done with this character. You know, we could always retire the character in a fun way. You can narratively retire them how you see fit, but I wasn't going to hold back either. You know, I was going to let the table, you know, the dice roll and play this how I thought I would. And, if he ended up getting, you know, killed in action, then so be it. I hope it would have been, you know, a very just over the top and, you know, glorious death. And so I think in his head, he was like playing his character more aggressively. I think he forgets when there are cars around how he tends to play his character. As a Nomad, he is obsessed with the idea of like, well, can I get in this car and ram it into things? And so he does that. This exoskeleton, this exosuit, this mech is stomping around. He's already taken damage. He's down to like 9 HP from just getting lit up by everything in sight. And he's like, can I get in this car and reverse it into this exoskeleton? And I was like, yeah, I mean, if that's what you want to do. I was like, just realize like you're potentially going to take a lot of damage here. You know, you get how much damage you get to rolled. You know, and if things go wrong, like you take damage directly here. He's okay, well, can I use my interface plugs and like jump out of the car while it's moving with it in reverse? And I was like, okay, but we're not going to make this easy. You know, it's a pretty risky maneuver to attempt to do. And he's like, yeah, that's fine. So he gets in it. This was a car that was like running the car that was in front of them at the intersection. He slams on it. I'm like, okay, give me your basic driving check. I was like, easy, you passed that, no problem. Okay, give me an athletics check. And his athletics are not good. And I set it pretty high. I was like, this isn't going to just be an easy thing to do. I'm not going to give you like a 17 or a 15 on this. I think he had to be to 21. He fails it. And then I'm like, okay, again, how can I've been trying to find ways to, you know, to leave some chance to things, right? Especially in situations where I feel like it makes sense to there to be just random consequence rather than it being me just deciding this is what happens. And especially knowing that he, in his mind, I think was like, you know, he might just be trying to kill my character now. Like, no matter how much I had a conversation with him and said, I will never do that. I feel like, you know, maybe it's in the back of your head. That's totally okay if it is. Thinking to yourself like, oh yeah, this character is just destined for death. He wasn't like playing it like he was all, you know, like, oh, I don't care what happens. He's still very much emotionally tied to this character. That was clear. And he was upset when he failed that athletics roll, but I was like, okay, there are 5 spaces between like you and the car and the exoskeleton. We're going to roll, or 6 spaces, I think it was. We're going to roll a 1d6. 1 is closest to you where the car started, and 6 is closest to the exoskeleton. And it rolls a 5. So he jumps out of the car just before it hits the exoskeleton, doesn't take any damage from that, but then ends up right next to this thing. And he is at a point in the initiative order where the Exo Hunter goes right after him. And so this Exo Hunter drops its massive shield out of it, this massive mechanical arm it has, and attempts to grapple him. And he's already evaded this thing twice now beforehand with it doing other like charging attacks with its shield. And so, you know, he's like, okay, well, easy. I can definitely get this evasion. He misses the evasion. This thing picks him up. And I was like, this thing has you by the waist and you feel it just crushing your bones underneath you. And I didn't want it to just kill him, obviously. I could have just been like, okay, we roll for damage, you die. You get crushed to death. I was like, this thing is going to attempt to crush Iggy over the next several turns. Here's what you guys can do. You've already identified all of the systems on this Exo Hunter, okay? What you can do is you can try to make an aim shot at its arm to aim for the internals between its armor plating. You're going to have to make an aim shot, though. And you have to roll damage that is higher than the armor plating, right? Like the idea that you are trying to get through the armor plating. This is going to be difficult. It's doable. You guys can definitely do it. You could also try to continue to get on top of this thing and get inside the cockpit and disarm it. Whatever you got going on here, totally fine. But I gave them this additional avenue, right? Of like saying, hey, you can totally try to do this. For every turn that he is grappled inside of this arm, we're going to roll a 1d6, and that's how much damage he's going to take directly to body. Armor is not going to help him here. He's being physically crushed by a massive mechanical force. And so right off the rip, we roll that dice. He takes like 5 damage. He's down to like 10 HP or something like that. I think he was at 12 actually going into this. He gets knocked down. He's like 9 HP or whatever, right? And then all of a sudden the rest of the crew is like, okay, here's what we're going to do. They're all trying to think of like ways to solve this, knowing that they always have a chance to fall back into that aim shot. However, the damage has got to be so high. A couple of them try it like right off the rip, don't get it. It actually comes back around to his turn. And he's like, well, can I shoot? I was like, yeah, you can definitely shoot it. You got your SMG, the DV, you can definitely beat it. You can make an aim shot point blank at this thing. I said, I'll give you advantage on the hit, since you're right in front of it. And, he tries, doesn't get enough damage on the first shot. He's like, can I do it again since I can't move? I was like, yeah, I'll let you shoot it twice. I mean, you're life or death right now. Right. And so he gets to roll again. It's not enough. We rolled a 1d6. It's like 2 damage. So he's low, but he is not dead. And then it comes around to Lynx, and Lynx is like trying to figure out these things they can do. They actually have a gun that has an optic that gives him like a huge buff to aim shots for the hit. And he's like, I'm just going to go for it. He does. And he like crits on damage. More than enough damage, manages to like fire through the armor plating, break the mechanicals, drops Ignition down on the ground with, his bruised and crushed insides, but fortunately not dead. And the combat kind of progresses from there. And he doesn't end up dying. The thing that blows my mind is, so before this, there are like 2 other opportunities where I attempted to like his character was just trying like to brute force this thing up close. He's just, so much potential to take tons of damage. That happens. And then he decides he's going to help the team, like start, trying to damage the components of this thing that have been exposed. So they actually did manage to strip away the armor plating. Basically, every time they take an aim shot, if they did enough damage, I would let them expose some of the armor plating and damage it enough where they're now shooting the raw SDP of this mech. Because this mech was comprised of essentially 3 different like health bars, for lack of a better term. It had its main armor, which had, again, it's insanely high SDP, starting at 28. They'd occasionally dwindle that down a little bit. I think they ended up with it at like 28 by the end. It also had the separate armor plating that was its cockpit. It had the pilot HP, which was another thing that they did eventually eliminate. They killed the pilot. And then it had an SDP. So just a structural damage value that they could dwindle away at. And that would pretty much start to shut the mech down and prevent it from moving altogether. So they actually blew its legs out. They take it out. They try to hijack this thing, but it's still rotating on the top half and shooting. At one point, he gets caught out in the open. And knowing that he was so low, again, if his character was killed, I wanted to make sure that he felt like it was just purely the odds against him, right? And so there are 4 of them, or 3 of them at one point. No, it was all 4 of them. All 4 of them are in like the line of sight of this thing, with the NPCs, Abria and Ryu and Sam being behind this thing. I'm like, okay, I'm going to roll a 1d4. Again, we're going to see who this mech attacks with its ranged attack right now. And he's a 4. Again, this time it's Iggy, who's like at this point at like 4 HP is a 4 or whatever. Roll the dice, it picks him. And it ends up rolling enough damage with his armor that he had that he is left with 1 HP. 1 HP. And then I do it again because this thing has a 2 rate of fires that was set up. They know that that's coming. I'm like, okay, we rolled the 1d of 4 again. Let's see if it switches targets. Like, because it's the AI at this point. There's no pilot in this thing. So I was having it try to function just in a very like sort of weakened AI mechanical state, just in like a survival mode, protect the suit type deal. Pilot's dead, so no protect the pilot for Titanfall fans out there. And it picks a different target, shoots, and he ends up surviving this thing. Eventually, they're able to like crush this thing down. Kick, who had been firing the microwaver gun, is like, I'm gonna, try and climb on this thing with Ryu. Ryu is already trying to mount this thing and to hack into it. He's like, I'm gonna go help Ryu. They end up overriding it and being able to shut this thing down entirely. It was a wild ride. I was like, I don't know what they're doing, like what their plans are, but we just keep throwing stuff at them. They keep deciphering and figuring it out. I didn't really get to talk too much with them about this one because it was so late when we wrapped up. And we led right into some other narrative stuff. But I hope they had a good time. I've been meaning to ask them about it. They seemed like they all had a blast. Nobody was like, that was a, unfun slog. They seemed like this was like a holy fuck moment, a realization of like, their odds are stacked against them in NC right now. And then we roll into a bunch of narrative stuff that we, further expand the story with. And honestly, I could talk so much longer about this stuff. I think we're going to leave that into the next vlog, the next devlog, because there's just so much to say there. But basically, they're kind of set up in a position now where they've got this information. They're able to find out a little bit about Black Tusk. Sophie returns. She's made some connections. She shows them photographs of Zarafa, working at this like abandoned factory and transporting tons of like unmarked Zarafa robotics components to some other group of individuals who are wearing these Black Tusk logos that they pulled off the pilot of the exosuit. That's like the one piece of like high value information they end up getting out of that fight, is this unfamiliar insignia that they've never seen, the business has never seen. Lynx reaches out to his, head honcho over at Danger Girl, to see if she, she's familiar with it. And she's like, we'll look through our database and get back to you. They do not know the name Black Tusk yet. They just know this black logo of this boar with 2 tusks that they're starting to see on these uniforms. And so it's up for them to dig into this. This is also going to be now the next thing they're going to be doing after some like more downtime activities. They're going to run wild the next time we play, which is actually going to be in 2 weeks instead of 1 because we're taking a 1-week break for some Pathfinder stuff. But they're going to start to dig into this mystery. Sophie's got a little bit of information about an individual that Mark Moreau made contact with before he vanished into the corporate ether, if you will. And so they're going to be chasing that down. There's just a bunch of breadcrumb trails for them to pick up on. And I feel like this is the first like more organic mystery I've given to them, to let them just follow the bits and pieces as they find them and make up, come to their own conclusions about things and try and get to the answer, which something that I'm not going to talk too much about because again, I could ramble for a lot longer. Thank you all so much for hanging out for me with this for this diary. If you've been following along and you enjoy it, and you have been enjoying the stories about the game, thanks. I appreciate you just hanging out and listening. I've got a combat counter design guide that I'm going to try and get out this week for you folks as well. And then I'll probably actually kick up a separate campaign diary because my buddy Mike, who's the business in my campaign, is going to be running a Pathfinder 1E campaign. I'm going to be a player in it. It's like the first time I really get to be a proper player character. I'm so excited. I'm playing a half-orc ranger. We're definitely going to talk about it. It's going to be a great time. So there's going to be multiple diaries on this channel, rotating every week, a player one to a GM one. And then we're going to be pumping out some of those GM guides as well that I'm very much looking forward to. Enjoy the rest of your day, folks. Take care of yourself out there. Be awesome to one another. I'll see you around.